What this man was about to discover on a desolate island that hadn't been touched by human hands since the 18th century would rewrite everything historians thought they knew about lost colonial treasure. The find would shake the foundations of maritime archaeology forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The endless blue of the Atlantic stretched before him as Marcus Reeves stood on the rocky shore of what locals called Deadman's Cay. The small, barren island off the coast of North Carolina had been his unexpected inheritance. A barren island off the coast of North Carolina. Final joke from his estranged uncle who had seemingly left him nothing but worthless rocks and scrubby vegetation. At 42, Marcus was at the end of his rope. 3 tours in Afghanistan had left him with a prosthetic leg, chronic pain that medications barely touched, and the kind of haunted stare that made civilians uncomfortable in grocery stores. His military pension barely covered rent for his 1-bedroom apartment in Jacksonville, and the modest disability benefits seemed to shrink against the rising tide of medical bills. The Veterans Affairs hospital visits had become a cruel routine, hours of waiting for 15 minutes with doctors who spoke in bureaucratic riddles about treatment authorizations and coverage limitations. The past 7 years since his medical discharge had been a blur of part-time jobs that never lasted, relationships that crumbled under the weight of his nightmares, and the slow erosion of the savings he had managed to accumulate during his 17 years of military service. When the letter had arrived from a law firm in Wilmington, North Carolina, Marcus had initially mistaken it for another collection notice. In accordance with the last will and testament of Robert Reeves, you have inherited all property and holdings associated with Deadman's Cay, located approximately 12 miles off the coast of Cape Fear, North Carolina. Marcus had stared at the paper for several minutes, trying to process what he was reading. Uncle Robert, the black sheep of the family who had disappeared when Marcus was a teenager, supposedly to seek his fortune in treasure hunting. The man had been a constant source of family embarrassment, with his wild theories about Spanish galleons and colonial shipping routes. The inheritance seemed like a cosmic joke. Marcus had called the lawyer, half expecting to learn it was some elaborate scam. But attorney James Whitaker had confirmed everything. Your uncle maintained ownership of the island for over 30 years, Whitaker had explained. It's approximately 47 acres. No structures, no development, no utilities. Just rocks and scrub brush, honestly. But it's yours free and clear. When Marcus had asked about the value, Whitaker's hesitation had told him everything. Property taxes are minimal due to its classification as non-developable land. It's in a protected marine zone, so building is restricted. Honestly, most people would consider it a liability rather than an asset. So my uncle left me a worthless rock in the middle of the ocean? Marcus had asked, a bitter laugh escaping before he could stop it. He also left you his boat, Whitaker had added. It's not much, a 30-foot vessel called the Eleanor. Been sitting at a marina in Southport for years. Paid up for another 6 months of docking fees. After that, well, it's your responsibility. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The inheritance had come at the lowest point in Marcus's life. The previous month, he had received an eviction notice after falling 2 months behind on rent. The part-time security job at the local mall had ended when new management brought in their own team. His application for increased disability benefits had been denied, requiring an appeal process that could take years. His prosthetic leg needed adjustments he couldn't afford, causing blisters and phantom pain that kept him awake at night. The opioid prescription that barely dulled the pain had been reduced due to new regulations, leaving him in a constant state of discomfort that clouded his thinking and shortened his temper. In a moment of desperate clarity, Marcus had realized he had nothing left to lose. With his few remaining possessions packed into his 15-year-old pickup truck, He had driven the 8 hours from Jacksonville, Florida, to Southport, North Carolina, following the coastline that had shaped his childhood, before the military had taken him to deserts and mountains far from the salt air that had once been his only source of peace. The marina manager, a weathered man named Mike Donovan, had greeted him with suspicious eyes that softened when Marcus showed him the inheritance paperwork and his military ID. "Robert's nephew, huh?" Donovan had said, studying Marcus's face as if looking for family resemblance. "Your uncle was an interesting character. Stubborn as hell. Kept talking about that island like it was going to make him rich someday." The Eleanor had been in better shape than Marcus expected, a sturdy vessel with faded paint and the kind of solid construction that survived decades with minimal maintenance. The cabin was small but functional, with a bunk, a tiny galley kitchen, and a navigation station covered in maps and charts marked with his uncle's cramped handwriting. "Your uncle spent most of his last 10 years living on this boat," Donovan had explained as he helped Marcus inspect the engine. "Only came ashore for supplies and the occasional medical check. Kept to himself, but paid his bills on time. Always respected that about him." The boat's logbooks revealed Robert's obsession with Deadman's Cay. Thousands of entries detailed weather patterns, tidal flows, underwater topography, and historical records about shipwrecks in the Cape Fear region. The man had approached his treasure hunting with the methodical precision of a scientist rather than the wild-eyed fanaticism Marcus had expected from family stories. That night, sleeping on the boat that smelled of salt, diesel, and his uncle's lingering presence, Marcus had studied the maps by flashlight. One chart in particular caught his attention, a detailed rendering of Deadman's Cay with notations about underwater features and precise coordinates marked with dates and cryptic symbols. A leather-bound journal had been tucked beneath the navigation station's seat cushion. The first entry, dated 28 years earlier, had captured Marcus's attention with its clear, determined tone. "I've purchased the island." The historical records matched the coordinates from the Charleston archives. "If I'm right about the Queen Anne's Mercy, this will change everything. The Colonial Maritime Council dismissed my research, but time and tides will prove them wrong." The following morning, Marcus had stocked the boat with supplies using the last of his savings and had set out for the island that represented either his final failure or an unlikely new beginning. The 12-mile journey had taken longer than expected as he reacquainted himself with boating skills dormant since his teenage years. Now standing on the rocky shore of Deadman's Cay, Marcus felt the weight of his uncle's obsession. The island was as uninspiring as the lawyer had described, a roughly oval landmass of approximately 47 acres, with rocky shores giving way to scrubby vegetation and a central rise that barely qualified as a hill. No fresh water source was visible, and the only signs of wildlife were the seabirds that wheeled overhead, their cries carried away by the persistent Atlantic wind. "What the hell were you thinking, Uncle Robert?" Marcus muttered, leaning on his walking stick as his prosthetic leg shifted uncomfortably in the uneven terrain. 30 years chasing ghosts on this godforsaken rock. The Weather Service had warned of an approaching storm system, nothing dangerous for someone safely on the mainland, but potentially concerning for a man with a prosthetic leg on an uninhabited island with a single small boat as his lifeline. Marcus had planned only a brief exploration before returning to Southport, but his curiosity about his uncle's obsession drove him to climb toward the island's central rise. The climb was painful, each step requiring careful placement to avoid falls that would be more than just embarrassing with his prosthetic. Sweat soaked his shirt despite the cool October breeze, and his breathing became labored, a reminder of his declining physical condition since leaving the structured fitness regimen of military life. At the top of the rise, approximately 60 feet above sea level, Marcus found the only sign of human presence on the island, a roughly constructed cairn of stones about 4 feet high. Secured beneath the top stone was a metal container, the kind used by hikers to store emergency supplies. Inside, protected from the elements, was a sealed letter addressed simply, "To my heir." Marcus sat on a nearby rock, catching his breath as he broke the seal on the envelope. The handwriting matched the journal entries he had read the previous night, precise, methodical, with a slight rightward slant that suggested determination. "If you're reading this, I've failed in my quest, but I'm passing the torch to you. This island isn't just worthless real estate, as everyone believes. It's the final resting place of the Queen Anne's Mercy, a British merchant vessel that disappeared in 1752 while carrying the Colonial governor's tax collection to England. The shipwreck lies just offshore in the eastern cove, but is only visible during extreme low tides that occur approximately once every 7 years when specific astronomical conditions align. My calculations indicate the next opportunity will be October 17th to 19th, 2025. 3 days when the tide will drop nearly 12 feet below normal, exposing portions of the seafloor that haven't been visible since I began my search. I've spent my life preparing for this window, but if you're reading this, I didn't live to see it. The historical record shows the Mercy carried gold and silver equivalent to approximately $520 million in today's currency. If I'm right, and I've staked my life that I am, this island will yield the greatest colonial-era treasure discovery in American history. The maritime archaeology community dismissed my research as amateur speculation, but the Charleston Harbor archives contained shipping manifests and captains' reports that aligned perfectly with the coordinates I've marked in my charts. The Mercy was deliberately erased from official records after its disappearance due to suspicions of crown embezzlement, but the evidence exists for those willing to look beyond conventional historical accounts. I've left you everything you need: the boat, the island, and my research. Whether you continue my quest or sell this worthless rock is your choice. But know that in 3 days of extreme low tide, the truth will be revealed one way or another. Your uncle, Robert Reeves. Marcus checked the date on his phone, October 15th, 2025. If his uncle's calculations were correct, the astronomical low tide would begin in just 2 days. Looking toward the eastern side of the island, Marcus could see the cove his uncle had mentioned, a semicircular indentation in the coastline, where the water appeared calmer than the windswept western shore. Nothing in the gently lapping waves suggested a centuries-old shipwreck lurking beneath the surface. The approaching storm clouds on the horizon reminded Marcus that he had planned to return to the mainland before weather conditions deteriorated. But his uncle's letter had sparked something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, however unlikely or irrational. The National Weather Service alert that pinged on his phone warned of a Category 2 hurricane changing course, now projected to pass directly over the Cape Fear region within 36 hours. Evacuation orders had been issued for coastal communities, and small craft warnings were in effect throughout the region. Logic dictated an immediate return to the mainland. But something, perhaps the same stubborn determination that had driven his uncle for 30 years, made Marcus hesitate. If he left now, he would miss the extreme low tide his uncle had calculated. And if Robert's research was correct, this astronomical event wouldn't repeat for another 7 years. The decision should have been simple. Risk death on an uninhabited island during a hurricane for the minuscule chance of discovering a colonial shipwreck, or return to safety and the grinding poverty and pain that had defined his post-military life. Marcus tucked his uncle's letter into his pocket and began the careful descent, back toward the shore where the Eleanor was anchored. The sky had darkened noticeably during his exploration, and the wind had intensified, creating whitecaps that hadn't been present when he arrived. Reaching the boat, Marcus secured the small inflatable dinghy he had used to reach shore and checked the weather updates again. The storm was accelerating, now expected to make landfall in under 24 hours. The sensible course was clear immediate return to the mainland while navigation was still possible. Instead, Marcus found himself securing additional anchor lines and preparing the boat for storm conditions. He moved essential supplies to waterproof containers and studied his uncle's detailed charts of the underwater topography surrounding the island. According to Robert's notes, the eastern cove offered natural protection from westerly storms due to the island's central rise and underlying reef structures. "I'm being an idiot," Marcus muttered as he maneuvered the Eleanor around to the eastern cove, fighting increasingly rough seas. This is exactly how people die at sea. Once anchored in the relative protection of the cove, with the island now blocking the worst of the building winds, Marcus made a final call to the marina using the boat's radio. "This is Marcus Reeves on the Eleanor. I've decided to shelter at Deadman's Cay during the storm. Please log my position." The marina operator's response was immediate and incredulous. "Sir, that's not advisable. Evacuation orders are in effect for all island and coastal areas. Coast Guard rescue operations will be suspended once storm conditions intensify." "Understood," Marcus replied. "It's my decision. I'm well anchored in a protected cove with adequate supplies." After signing off, Marcus secured all loose equipment and retreated to the cabin. Through the small windows, he watched as the sky continued to darken. The barometer was dropping rapidly, confirming what the Weather Service had predicted. Hurricane Delilah was intensifying as it approached. That night, as the storm's outer bands reached the island, Marcus read through his uncle's journals by the light of a battery-powered lantern. Robert's obsession with the Queen Anne's Mercy had begun with an obscure reference in Colonial tax records he'd discovered while researching his family history. The Reeves family had been among the early settlers of North Carolina, arriving in 1735 as part of the wave of European colonization. Robert had discovered that his 5 times great-grandfather, William Reeves, had served as a customs official in the port of Brunswick, a colonial settlement near present-day Southport. William Reeves had been among the last people to document the Queen Anne's Mercy before its disappearance. His log entries noted concerns about the ship's captain, a man named Jonathan Blackwell, who had delayed departure for 3 days citing needed repairs, while reportedly engaging in suspicious activities with local smugglers. When the Mercy finally departed on October 18, 1752, carrying the colony's quarterly tax payment to the Crown, it had sailed directly into a powerful autumn storm. No wreckage was ever officially found, and the British Crown had ultimately held the colonial government responsible for the lost funds, imposing additional taxes that had contributed to the growing resentment eventually leading to revolution. But William Reeves's personal diary, passed down through the family and eventually discovered by Robert in an attic trunk, told a different story. The customs official had written of rumors that Captain Blackwell had intentionally sailed the Mercy onto the submerged reef surrounding an uninhabited island, collaborating with smugglers to steal the Crown's gold while blaming the loss on the storm. Robert had spent decades cross-referencing historical weather data, shipping routes, and underwater topography to identify Deadman's Cay as the most likely location of the intentional shipwreck. His theory was that Blackwell had timed his departure to coincide with the approaching storm, providing cover for the planned accident while ensuring that search efforts would be delayed. The final piece of Robert's research had been the discovery of the 7-year astronomical tide cycle that would expose sections of the seafloor surrounding the island's eastern cove. His calculations showed that if the Mercy had indeed been deliberately run aground in this location, the extreme low tide would reveal portions of the wreck that had remained hidden for centuries. As the storm intensified throughout the night, the Eleanor strained against her anchor lines. The howling wind and lashing rain created a cacophony that made sleep impossible. Marcus checked the anchor lines hourly, ensuring they held against the building seas. Each trip to the deck was a dangerous exercise, requiring him to secure safety lines to compensate for both the violently rocking boat and the limitations of his prosthetic leg. By dawn, Hurricane Delilah had reached full strength, passing directly over Deadman's Cay with sustained winds of 105 miles per hour. Inside the cabin, Marcus braced himself as waves crashed over the boat, finding leaks and seals he hadn't had time to properly maintain. He bailed water continuously for hours, fighting exhaustion and the pain that radiated from his leg stump. The storm's passage was mercifully quick, with conditions beginning to improve by mid-afternoon. As the wind diminished from terrifying to merely dangerous, Marcus ventured onto the deck to assess the damage. The Eleanor had survived relatively intact, a testament to his uncle's choice of vessel and Marcus's seafaring instincts in selecting the protected cove. The island itself, however, had been transformed. The hurricane's storm surge had reshaped the coastline, scouring away sections of the shore and depositing new sandbanks. Trees and vegetation that had managed to survive on the inhospitable island for decades had been stripped away, leaving a landscape even more barren than when Marcus had arrived. And there, in the eastern cove where the water was beginning to recede as the storm pushed massive volumes of ocean water away from the coastline, something had emerged from beneath the waves, the unmistakable wooden ribs of a ship's hull protruding from the seafloor like the skeleton of some ancient beast. The hurricane had accomplished what Robert Reeves had waited his entire life to witness. The storm surge, followed by the rapid outflow of water, had combined with the approaching astronomical low tide to expose portions of a shipwreck exactly where his calculations had predicted. Despite his exhaustion, despite the pain shooting through his residual limb, despite the rational voice warning him of the dangers of entering the water so soon after a hurricane, Marcus found himself launching the small inflatable dinghy and rowing toward the exposed wreckage. The tide was continuing to recede, revealing more of the ship with each passing minute. The wooden structure had been preserved by centuries, buried in the oxygen-poor sediment of the seafloor, protected from the destructive marine organisms that would normally reduce such materials to nothing. As Marcus approached, he could see that the hurricane had not just exposed the wreck, but had shifted massive amounts of sand and sediment that had covered it for centuries. The force of the storm had effectively excavated portions of the site that might have required months of careful archaeological work under normal circumstances. Securing the dinghy to one of the exposed ribs, Marcus carefully lowered himself into the knee-deep water. His prosthetic leg made movement difficult in the unstable seafloor, but the walking stick he had brought provided enough support to prevent falls. Each step was a careful negotiation between determination and physical limitation. The exposed section of the wreck stretched approximately 60 feet, clearly only a portion of the original vessel. The hurricane had cleared sand and debris from what appeared to be the cargo hold, revealing the unmistakable shapes of wooden crates and barrels still intact after nearly 3 centuries underwater. Marcus approached one partially exposed crate where the wood had split, revealing a glimpse of what lay inside. Using his walking stick, he carefully widened the opening. The gleam of gold caught the afternoon sun like coins, hundreds of them, still stacked in neat rows despite the centuries and the violence of the recent storm. Marcus lifted one from its resting place, examining the profile of King George II stamped into the metal. The date was clearly visible, 1751. For the first time in years, perhaps since before the explosion that had taken his leg in Afghanistan, Marcus Reeves laughed with genuine joy. His uncle hadn't been crazy after all. The Queen Anne's Mercy was real, its treasure intact, and through some twist of fate or divine intervention, it had been revealed not by the astronomical tide Robert had calculated, but by the hurricane that logic said should have killed his nephew. As Marcus stood in the shallow water, surrounded by the emerging evidence of his uncle's vindication, he realized that this discovery would change everything, not just for him, but for historians, archaeologists, and perhaps even the understanding of colonial American history itself. The treasure's value was almost secondary to the historical significance of finding a deliberately lost British ship carrying colonial tax payments. The sun was beginning to set as Marcus carefully documented the site with his phone's camera. Tomorrow, when the astronomical low tide his uncle had calculated would combine with the post-hurricane water recession, even more of the wreck would be exposed. But already, Marcus knew he had discovered something beyond price, not just gold, but purpose. As darkness fell over Deadman's Cay, Marcus returned to the Eleanor, exhausted but filled with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt since before his injury. In the boat's cabin, he found his uncle's final logbook entry, written just weeks before his death. "I may not live to see the tide reveal the Mercy, but I've done everything possible to ensure my heir will have the chance I've worked toward my entire life." Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't gold or silver, but the pursuit of truth against all odds and the legacy we leave for those who come after us. Marcus ran his fingers over the gold coin he had retrieved from the wreck, tangible proof that sometimes, against all odds, persistence and faith could be rewarded. Tomorrow would bring decisions about archaeological authorities, salvage rights, historical preservation, and the complex legal questions surrounding a colonial shipwreck worth potentially hundreds of millions. But tonight, on this small boat anchored beside a formerly worthless island, a broken soldier had found something more valuable than treasure. He had found his way forward. The inheritance that had seemed like a cruel joke had become the foundation for a new beginning. And somewhere, Marcus liked to think, his uncle was watching with satisfaction as the treasure he had spent a lifetime pursuing finally emerged from the depths, ready to rewrite history just as he had always believed it would. The storm that should have driven Marcus away had instead revealed what generations of skeptics had dismissed as fantasy. Sometimes, it seemed, the path forward revealed itself only when all logical options had been exhausted and only faith remained. For Marcus Reeves, that faith borrowed from an uncle he had barely known had changed everything. The dawn light filtered through the cabin windows of the Eleanor as Marcus awoke with a jolt, momentarily disoriented before remembering where he was anchored off. Deadman's Cay, with a colonial shipwreck emerging from the seafloor just yards away. His body ached from the previous day's exertions, the stump of his left leg throbbing where the prosthetic had rubbed raw during the storm. But physical discomfort couldn't dampen the fire of discovery burning within him. Rolling carefully from the narrow bunk, Marcus checked the tide charts his uncle had meticulously prepared. Robert's calculations had been precise. Today would bring the lowest astronomical tide in 7 years, enhanced by the hurricane's disruption of normal water patterns. The Queen Anne's Mercy would reveal more of herself today than at any point since she disappeared. Beneath the waves in 1752, through the cabin window, Marcus could see that the water had already receded significantly since the previous evening. What had been knee-deep water around the exposed ribs of the shipwreck was now barely ankle-deep, with more of the colonial vessel becoming visible with each passing hour. His satellite phone, the emergency communication device he'd splurged on, despite his limited funds, showed multiple missed calls from the Coast Guard and regional emergency services. The hurricane had caused significant damage along the Carolina coast, and authorities were conducting welfare checks on all registered vessels in the area. Marcus returned the calls, assuring the concerned Coast Guard officer that he had weathered the storm safely and was in no immediate danger. He deliberately omitted mentioning the shipwreck, buying himself time to document the discovery before government agencies and salvage companies descended on the site. "I've got food and water for several days," he told the officer. "Once the seas calm further, I'll make my way back to port." After a hasty breakfast of coffee and protein bars, Marcus prepared for a full day of exploration. His prosthetic leg would make working in the unstable sand and shallow water challenging, but he had navigated far worse conditions during his military rehabilitation. The discovery warranted whatever physical toll it might exact. Gathering his phone for documentation, a waterproof bag for collecting samples, and his uncle's detailed site maps, Marcus lowered himself into the dinghy. The morning air carried the cleansed feeling that often follows major storms, crisp, salt-tinged and vibrant with possibility. The island itself looked scoured, with exposed rock faces where vegetation had been stripped away by the hurricane's fury. As Marcus rode toward the increasingly exposed shipwreck, he noticed something he had missed in the fading light of the previous evening. Hurricane had not just uncovered the ship, but had carved a channel through the seafloor, creating what amounted to a natural archaeological trench alongside the port side of the vessel. Reaching the wreck, Marcus secured the dinghy and carefully lowered himself into the shallow water. Where yesterday the exposed portion had been limited to the upper structure and partial cargo hold, now nearly 2/3 of the Mercy lay revealed in the receding tide, her wooden bones, preserved by centuries of sand and silt that had protected them from oxygen and destructive marine organisms. The ship was smaller than modern vessels but substantial for its era, approximately 85 feet in length, with the characteristic design of a mid-18th century merchant vessel. The hurricane's force had cleared away sediment from the cargo hold and what appeared to be the captain's quarters, creating unprecedented access to areas that would normally require months of careful archaeological excavation. Marcus moved carefully around the exposed wreck, documenting everything with his phone's camera. The ship's construction, the cargo arrangement, the personal effects emerging from what had been officers' quarters, all provided insights into colonial maritime practices that would excite historians and archaeologists around the world. But it was the ship's cargo hold that would capture global attention. The hurricane had torn away centuries of protective sediment to reveal row upon row of wooden crates and barrels, many still intact despite their age. Where water and time had deteriorated the containers, their contents spilled out across the sandy bottom, gold and silver coins by the thousands, tax collection plates engraved with the British royal seal, and manifests partially legible despite centuries underwater. Marcus carefully documented each section of the exposed cargo, mindful that the astronomical low tide wouldn't last forever. By tomorrow, rising waters would reclaim much of what was currently visible, potentially reburying portions of the wreck until the next 7-year tide cycle or another hurricane altered the underwater landscape yet again. In what had been the captain's quarters, Marcus discovered something unexpected: a small locked chest, its iron fittings corroded, but still holding the wooden box sealed. Using his walking stick as leverage, he carefully pried open the deteriorated lock, mindful not to damage what might be inside. The chest contained not treasure, but documents, dozens of sealed packets preserved by the waterproof seals that colonial officials had used for important correspondence. The hurricane's excavation of this section of the wreck had occurred so recently that seawater had barely begun to penetrate the wax and resin seals that had protected the contents for nearly 3 centuries. Marcus carefully transferred the document packets to his waterproof bag, recognizing that they might contain historical information far more valuable than even the gold coins scattered across the seafloor. If Captain Blackwell had indeed intentionally wrecked the Mercy as part of a smuggling scheme, these documents might provide evidence that would rewrite understanding of colonial corruption and perhaps even early revolutionary sentiment. As the day progressed and the tide reached its lowest point, Marcus continued his systematic documentation of the site. The full extent of the treasure was becoming clear, far beyond what even his uncle had estimated. Based on the visible cargo and his uncle's research on colonial tax shipments, Marcus estimated the site contained gold, silver, and artifacts worth approximately $520 million in modern valuation, potentially the richest colonial-era shipwreck ever discovered in North American waters. But the historical significance exceeded even that staggering figure. The Queen Anne's Mercy had disappeared at a pivotal moment in colonial history, just as tensions between the American colonies and the British Crown were beginning to simmer. The lost tax shipment had led to punitive additional taxes on the North Carolina colony, feeding the resentment that would eventually contribute to revolutionary sentiment. By mid-afternoon, The tide had begun its inevitable return, gradually reclaiming the sections of the wreck that had been exposed. Marcus made a final circuit of the site, capturing video of areas that would soon be underwater again. The physical exertion had taken its toll. His residual limb burned with pain where the prosthetic socket had rubbed the skin raw, and his back ached from hours bent over examining the wreck in the shallow water. Returning to the Eleanor, Marcus carefully spread the document packets to dry in the cabin, arranging them on clean towels to prevent further degradation. The satellite phone showed dozens more missed calls, not just from the Coast Guard now, but from Attorney Whitaker and several numbers Marcus didn't recognize. News traveled fast in coastal communities, and Marcus suspected someone from the marina had connected the dots between his presence at Deadman's Cay, the hurricane's passage, and the astronomical low tide his uncle had researched for decades. Treasure hunters and salvage operators would already be mobilizing, eager to claim a share of whatever might have been uncovered. As evening approached, Marcus faced a critical decision. Maritime law and archaeological preservation regulations required reporting the discovery of historical shipwrecks, particularly those potentially containing valuable artifacts. Failure to report could result in criminal charges and forfeiture of any salvage rights he might otherwise claim as the property owner. But immediate reporting without proper documentation and legal preparation could result in losing control of the site and potentially watching others profit from his uncle's lifelong research. The island deed gave Marcus certain rights to the surrounding seabed under North Carolina law, but federal maritime regulations and historic preservation statutes created a complex legal landscape that could take years to navigate. Marcus called Attorney Whitaker, who answered on the first ring with uncharacteristic eagerness. "Marcus, thank God you're alive. The Coast Guard reported you'd ridden out the hurricane at Deadman's Cay. What were you thinking?" "James, I need your absolute discretion on something," Marcus said, cutting through the lawyer's concern. "I found it. The Queen Anne's Mercy. The hurricane exposed it exactly where Uncle Robert predicted." The silence on the line lasted several seconds before Whitaker responded, his voice lowered as if afraid of being overheard. "Are you certain? This isn't just scattered debris or a more recent wreck. I'm holding a gold sovereign with King George II's face and the date 1751, Marcus replied. "The ship's construction, location, and cargo all match Robert's research exactly. This is the Mercy, and from what I can see, most of her cargo is intact." Whitaker's intake of breath was audible. "Marcus, this changes everything. The legal implications alone. We need to move carefully here." "I need to know my options," Marcus said, watching the sun begin to set over the Atlantic. "If I report this officially right now, what happens?" "Federal agencies would secure the site immediately. Given the historical significance, the Army Corps of Engineers and the Archaeological Resources Protection Act would come into play. You'd likely retain some salvage rights as the property owner, but control of the excavation and ultimate disposition of artifacts would fall under federal jurisdiction. And if I take more time to document everything properly before reporting." Whitaker hesitated. "Legally speaking, you're required to report the discovery without undue delay. However, as the property owner conducting legitimate research on your own land, you have some leeway to properly document your find before formal notification. The key is that you cannot remove or sell artifacts without proper permits." The lawyer paused before continuing. "Marcus, your uncle spent 30 years searching for this shipwreck. His research notes, surveys, and historical documentation could establish your priority claim as the discoverer. That matters tremendously in salvage rights adjudication. How long can I reasonably document before reporting without crossing legal lines?" Marcus asked. "Document everything for the next 72 hours, Whitaker advised. "I'll prepare the necessary legal notifications and assemble a team of maritime attorneys and archaeological experts who can help protect your interests. But Marcus, don't remove anything more from the wreck. Photograph, video, measure, but leave artifacts in place for now. After ending the call, Marcus reviewed the hundreds of photos and videos he had captured throughout the day. The documentation was comprehensive, but would benefit from another day of careful recording, particularly as the tide would again be exceptionally low tomorrow before beginning its return to normal patterns. That night, by lantern light in the Eleanor's cabin, Marcus carefully examined one of the document packets from the captain's chest. The seal had begun to deteriorate after its exposure to modern air, and the contents would soon be at risk without proper conservation measures. Making a careful judgment call between preservation and information gathering, Marcus gently opened the least damaged packet, revealing a handwritten letter that had remained untouched since being sealed in 1752. Ink had faded but remained legible. To Lord Harrington, Treasury Office, London. Esteemed Lord Harrington, as instructed, I have secured alternate transport for the special cargo discussed in your previous correspondence. The official manifest lists only the standard tax collection, while the additional materials are secured in the false floor compartment beneath my quarters. Captain Blackwell understands the sensitive nature of this arrangement and has been compensated accordingly for his discretion. The Colonial Governor remains unaware of our private arrangement regarding the indigenous artifacts and geological specimens collected from the Western Territories. These items, particularly the gold samples from the mountain region, would raise undue speculation if included in official reports at this time. I anticipate arrival in London by early December, weather permitting, and will deliver the special cargo directly to your residence as arranged. Your loyal servant, William Prentice, Crown Liaison for Colonial Acquisitions. Marcus stared at the document, understanding its implications. The Queen Anne's Mercy had been carrying more than just tax collections. It had been secretly transporting gold samples and indigenous artifacts from Western Territories that weren't officially explored by colonial authorities until decades later. This suggested covert operations beyond the knowledge of colonial governors, potentially gathering intelligence about resources that could influence Crown policy toward the colonies. If authentic and everything about the document's physical characteristics suggested it was, this letter alone would force historians to reconsider the timeline of British exploration in North America and potentially reshape understanding of the economic motivations behind colonial policies, leading to the American Revolution. The discovery of gold samples being secretly shipped to London decades before official exploration of the Western Territories would suggest the Crown had far more information about American resources than historical records indicated, information that may have influenced taxation policies and territorial disputes that contributed to revolutionary sentiment. As Marcus carefully returned the document to its protective covering, he felt the weight of historical significance pressing upon him. The Queen Anne's Mercy wasn't just a treasure ship. It was a time capsule containing evidence that might fundamentally alter understanding of the colonial era and the forces that shaped American independence. Sleep came fitfully that night, Marcus's mind racing with the implications of what lay on the seafloor beside his anchored boat. The gold and silver represented immediate, tangible value, a fortune that could transform his life after years of post-military struggle. But the historical information, the documents, the evidence of secret Crown operations in early America, these had value beyond simple monetary measurement. At dawn, Marcus returned to the wreck site to find the tide again extraordinarily low, revealing sections of the Mercy that had remained hidden the previous day. The hurricane scouring effect had created unprecedented archaeological access, exposing layers of the wreck that would normally require years of careful excavation to reach. During this second day of documentation, Marcus discovered what appeared to be a false floor compartment in the captain's quarters, exactly as described in the letter he had read the previous evening. The compartment contained small sealed ceramic containers, unlike the wooden crates and barrels in the main cargo hold. Careful inspection without disturbing the containers revealed labels identifying contents from locations in what would now be Tennessee, Kentucky, and West Virginia territories not officially explored by British authorities until decades after the Mersey disappeared. One container had cracked in the hurricane's disturbance of the site, revealing raw gold samples alongside detailed location maps. The implications were staggering. If the British Crown had secret knowledge of gold deposits in Western territories as early as 1752, it would explain policies that attempted to prevent colonial expansion beyond the Appalachian Mountains after the French and Indian War, policies that generated significant colonial resentment and contributed to revolutionary sentiment. Throughout the day, Marcus meticulously documented every aspect of the wreck, creating a comprehensive record that would establish his uncle's research as the foundation for the discovery and strengthen his legal position regarding salvage rights. The tide was beginning its gradual return to normal patterns, slowly reclaiming sections of the wreck with each passing hour. By late afternoon, Marcus had compiled thousands of photographs, hours of video footage, and detailed measurements of the wreck site. The documentation was comprehensive enough to support formal notification to authorities, while establishing his priority as the discoverer based on his uncle's decades of research. Returning to the Eleanor, Marcus was surprised to find a Coast Guard vessel approaching from the direction of the mainland. The boat slowed as it neared his position, and Marcus recognized the uniform of a federal officer alongside the Coast Guard personnel. "Marcus Reeves?" called the Coast Guard commander as the vessel came alongside the Eleanor. "That's me," Marcus confirmed, understanding that the moment of decision had arrived sooner than he had hoped. "Sir, this is Special Agent Larson with NOAA's Maritime Heritage Program. We've received information suggesting there may be a shipwreck of historical significance on or near your property. We're here to conduct a preliminary assessment under federal maritime preservation statutes." Marcus took a deep breath, weighing his options. Denial would be futile and potentially criminal. Someone perhaps from the marina or a passing vessel, or even satellite imagery reviewed after the hurricane, had identified the exposed wreck and reported it to authorities. "I was planning to contact you tomorrow," Marcus said, maintaining calm despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "I've spent the last 2 days documenting the site to provide comprehensive information for your assessment." Agent Larson studied Marcus with professional interest. "You've been documenting rather than salvaging? That's unusual for a private discoverer." "My uncle spent 30 years researching this wreck," Marcus replied. "He understood its historical significance goes beyond the monetary value. I've been honoring his work by ensuring proper documentation before notification." The federal agent's expression softened slightly. "Your uncle was Robert Reeves, correct? His research proposals crossed my desk several times over the years. The academic community dismissed his theories about the Queen Anne's Mersey, but his methodology was always impeccable." Marcus felt a surge of vindication on his uncle's behalf. "Then you understand why proper documentation was my priority. I have thousands of photos and videos ready to share with your team." Over the next hour, Marcus provided the federal officials with selected documentation that confirmed the wreck's identity, while Agent Larson explained the legal process that would now unfold. As the property owner who had legitimately discovered a historic shipwreck through documented research efforts, Marcus would retain certain rights during the excavation and conservation process. "Your cooperation now substantially strengthens your legal position," Agent Larson explained. "Had you attempted to remove artifacts or delay reporting, federal courts would view your claim less favorably. The official site assessment would begin tomorrow, with federal archaeologists establishing preservation protocols before the rising tide reburied portions of the wreck. Marcus would be included in the process as the property owner and discoverer, with his uncle's research formally acknowledged in all official documentation." As the Coast Guard vessel departed with plans to return at dawn with a scientific team, Marcus felt a complex mixture of emotions. The discovery was now official, the bureaucratic machinery engaged, and his role transitioning from lone explorer to participant in a regulated archaeological process. Looking toward the wreck site as the evening sun cast long shadows across the water, Marcus thought about the journey that had brought him here, from wounded warrior to reluctant heir to historical discoverer. His uncle's obsession, once dismissed as eccentricity, had been vindicated in the most dramatic fashion possible. The Queen Anne's Mercy would reshape understanding of colonial history while providing Marcus with the financial security that had eluded him since his medical discharge. More importantly, it had given him purpose, a bridge between past and future, between his uncle's legacy and his own potential. As darkness fell over Deadman's Cay, Marcus knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges: government agencies, archaeological protocols, legal negotiations, and media attention. The peaceful solitude of discovery would give way to the complex reality of managing a find of historical significance. But for tonight, in this moment between discovery and disclosure, Marcus allowed himself to appreciate the extraordinary turn his life had taken. The inheritance that had seemed worthless had revealed one of history's most valuable secrets, and in doing so, had offered a wounded veteran the rarest of gifts, a second chance and a meaningful purpose. The tide was turning, both literally and figuratively, as waters gradually reclaimed portions of the Queen Anne's Mercy. Marcus Reeves, prepared for a future he could never have imagined when he first received news of his uncle's worthless bequest, a future where the past itself would provide the foundation for an entirely new chapter in his life. The morning sun painted Deadman's Cay in golden light as a fleet of government vessels approached from the mainland. Marcus watched from the deck of the Eleanor as boats carrying archaeological teams, conservation specialists, and federal officials anchored near the shipwreck site. What had been his solitary discovery just 2 days earlier had now become an official government operation. Agent Larson approached in a small launch, accompanied by a woman whose weathered face and confident bearing suggested years of field work. "Mr. Reeves, this is Dr. Eliza Montgomery, our lead maritime archaeologist from the Smithsonian. She'll be coordinating the preliminary assessment of the site." Dr. Montgomery extended her hand as she stepped aboard the Eleanor. "Mr. Reeves, I reviewed your documentation overnight. Remarkable work, especially given the circumstances. Your uncle's research notes were particularly impressive. The academic community owes him an apology for dismissing his theories." The acknowledgement of his uncle's work meant more to Marcus than he'd expected. He dedicated 30 years to finding this ship when everyone said he was chasing ghosts. "Obsession sometimes looks like madness until it's proven right," Dr. Montgomery replied, examining the charts and notes spread across Marcus's navigation table. "Though I must say, riding out a Category 2 hurricane to be here for the low tide cycle shows the apple didn't fall far from the tree." Over coffee in the cramped cabin, Dr. Montgomery outlined the process that would unfold over the coming weeks. "The astronomical tide window gives us unprecedented access for another 36 hours before water levels return to normal. We'll focus on thorough documentation, stabilization of the most vulnerable artifacts, and establishing a long-term preservation plan." "And my role in all this?" Marcus asked, watching the teams of divers and technicians setting up equipment on the surrounding vessels. "As the property owner and the individual whose family research led to this discovery, you have certain legal rights," Dr. Montgomery explained. "You'll be included as a consulting party throughout the excavation and conservation process, with input on major decisions affecting the site." Marcus nodded toward the document packets he had recovered from the captain's quarters. "These may be the most historically significant items from the wreck. I've examined one that suggests the British Crown was conducting secret resource surveys in Western territories decades before official exploration. Dr. Montgomery's eyes widened as she carefully examined the sealed packets. If authentic, and they certainly appear to be, these documents could fundamentally alter our understanding of colonial policy and, perhaps even the economic motivations behind restrictions on westward expansion that contributed to revolutionary sentiment. By mid-morning, Marcus found himself at the center of an archaeological operation that would have been unimaginable just days earlier. Wearing a wetsuit provided by the NOAA team to protect his prosthetic leg during water operations, he guided the archaeological team through the wreck site, identifying key features he had documented. During his initial exploration, Dr. Montgomery moved methodically through the exposed sections of the Mercy, her experienced eye-catching details even Marcus had missed. The ship's construction suggests it was built for speed rather than cargo capacity, she observed, examining the hull design. Unusual for a tax transport vessel, but consistent with your uncle's theory about its involvement in covert operations. The special compartment in the captain's quarters drew particular attention from the archaeological team. The ceramic containers with gold samples and location maps from unexplored territories represented potentially explosive historical evidence about British Crown activities in pre-revolutionary America. "These containers are extraordinary," Dr. Montgomery murmured as technicians photographed each item in situ before preparing them for controlled recovery. "The preservation is remarkable, and the contents. Well, let's just say historians will be rewriting textbooks based on what we're finding here." As the day progressed, news of the discovery spread through official channels, triggering responses from institutions around the world. Marcus's satellite phone rang constantly with calls from museum directors, university researchers, media outlets, and government officials, all eager to stake some claim to information about the historic find. Attorney Whitaker had arrived on site by mid-afternoon, accompanied by a maritime law specialist whose expertise would prove crucial in the coming negotiations over salvage rights and artifact disposition. "The situation is developing better than I could have hoped," Whitaker told Marcus during a brief consultation aboard the Eleanor. "Your decision to document thoroughly before removing artifacts has established you as a responsible steward rather than a treasure hunter. That distinction will be crucial in determining your rights to the salvage value." By evening, as teams continued working under powerful lights that illuminated the wreck site, Marcus found himself in a strategy session with his legal team and Dr. Montgomery aboard one of the larger research vessels. "The archaeological and historical significance of this site cannot be overstated," Dr. Montgomery explained. "Based on just our preliminary assessment, I'd rank the Queen Anne's Mercy among the top 5 most important colonial-era shipwreck discoveries in North American waters, both for its cargo value and its historical implications." The maritime attorney, Catherine Zhao, outlined the complex legal landscape they now faced. Federal maritime law, archaeological preservation statutes, North Carolina property rights, and international heritage conventions all come into play here. The good news is that as the property owner whose research led to this discovery, Marcus has established a strong priority claim. "What does that mean in practical terms?" Marcus asked, still struggling to process the rapid transformation of his circumstances. "Based on similar cases, you could expect to receive between 30 to 40% of the recoverable treasure's market value," Zhao explained. "With preliminary estimates placing the gold and silver cargo at approximately $520 million, your potential share would be in the $156 to $208 million range." The numbers seemed unreal to Marcus, whose checking account had shown a balance of $1,273.18 just days earlier. And the historical artifacts? The documents and maps? Those typically remain in the public domain through museums and research institutions, Dr. Montgomery interjected. "But as the discoverer, you would retain recognition rights and potentially ongoing consultation roles in their exhibition and interpretation." As the meeting concluded, Marcus stepped outside onto the vessel's deck, needing a moment alone to process the extraordinary turn his life had taken. The night was clear, stars filling the sky above Deadman's Cay in a display that seemed to mock the insignificance of human concerns against the cosmic backdrop. From poverty to potential wealth beyond imagination in less than a week. From dismissed veteran to celebrated discoverer in the blink of an eye. The whiplash of circumstances left him dizzy with possibilities he had never allowed himself to contemplate during the grinding struggle of post-military life. A figure joined him at the railing. Agent Larson, his official demeanor softened by the day's shared excitement. "Quite a view," he commented, nodding toward the illuminated wreck site where teams continued working through the night to maximize the low tide window. "I keep thinking I'll wake up," Marcus admitted. "Back in my apartment with the leaky ceiling and past due notices." Larson studied him with unexpected perception. "Afghanistan?" "3 tours. Last one ended badly outside Kandahar. IED took my leg and 2 of my friends." The federal agent nodded. "Marines 2004 to 2012, Iraq mostly. Came home with all my parts but left some of my mind over there." The shared understanding of military service created an immediate connection that transcended their different positions in the unfolding drama of the shipwreck. "You know what's strangest about all this?" Marcus said after a moment. "I was ready to sell the island and boat as soon as possible. If the hurricane hadn't hit exactly when it did, forcing me to stay." "Some might call that fate," Larson suggested. "My uncle would have called it stubbornness finally paying off," Marcus replied with a smile. "He used to say that most people quit just before the miracle happens." The following morning brought new developments as the tide reached its lowest point of the 7-year cycle. Sections of the Mercy that had remained hidden even after the hurricane's scouring were briefly exposed, revealing additional cargo areas and what appeared to be the ship's payroll. Chests containing not just coins but detailed records of crew, payments that provided unprecedented insights into maritime labor practices during the colonial era. Marcus worked alongside the archaeological teams throughout the day, his military training evident in his methodical approach to the site documentation and his physical resilience despite the challenges posed by working in water with a prosthetic limb. Dr. Montgomery had quietly ensured that her team accommodated his physical limitations without drawing attention to them, a courtesy that didn't go unnoticed. "You've got a good team," Marcus commented during a brief break, as they watched specialists carefully extracting a chest of silver ingots from the cargo hold. "The best in the business," Dr. Montgomery agreed. "Though I must say, they're impressed with you. Not many civilians could keep pace with our field operations, especially under these conditions." By mid-afternoon, news helicopters circled overhead as media outlets from around the world converged on the previously obscure island. The Coast Guard had established a security perimeter around the archaeological site, keeping curious boaters and potential treasure hunters at a distance. Attorney Whitaker approached as Marcus was reviewing sonar images of portions of the wreck that remained below the current water line. "We've got interest from Netflix, National Geographic, and the BBC for documentary rights," the lawyer reported. "And the Smithsonian is formally requesting first consideration for exhibition rights once conservation is complete." The casual mention of opportunities that would have seemed laughably implausible just days earlier underscored how completely Marcus's life had transformed. From struggling to make rent on a 1-bedroom apartment to fielding offers from global media companies, all because he had chosen to explore an inheritance that had initially seemed worthless. As the day progressed, technical teams completed the preliminary site survey, establishing a comprehensive digital map of the Mercy and its surroundings that would guide the full excavation process in the coming months. The most vulnerable artifacts had been stabilized and prepared for transport to conservation facilities on the mainland, while sophisticated monitoring equipment was installed to track site conditions once the Rising tide resubmerged portions of the wreck. That evening, as the governmental vessels prepared for their return to port with the first recovered artifacts, Dr. Montgomery requested a private meeting with Marcus aboard the Eleanor. She arrived carrying a waterproof case that she placed carefully on the navigation table. "Before these go into official custody, I thought you should see what we found in the false compartment beneath the captain's quarters," she said, opening the case to reveal several leather-bound journals and a series of maps unlike any Marcus had seen in his uncle's research materials. The journals contain detailed accounts of multiple covert missions conducted by the Queen Anne's Mercy in the years before its final voyage missions that had never appeared in any official colonial records. The ship had apparently served as a secret intelligence vessel, gathering information about French military positions, indigenous tribal alliances, and natural resources throughout territories nominally under French control. Most striking were Captain Blackwell's personal notes about his instructions from Lord Harrington instructions that explicitly mentioned undermining colonial governance by creating financial crises that would increase dependence on Crown authority. The final entries confirmed Robert Reeves's theory about the intentional wrecking of the vessel, but with an unexpected twist. According to these entries, Blackwell did intentionally run the ship onto the reefs, Dr. Montgomery explained, but not as part of a smuggling operation as your uncle theorized. He was apparently a double agent working for colonial interests who discovered the Crown's plans to use resource information to increase economic control over the colonies. The revelation cast the Mercy in an entirely new light, not simply as a tax transport or even a covert intelligence vessel, but as a pivotal element in the complex political maneuvering that would eventually lead to revolution. Blackwell had sacrificed the ship and apparently his own life to prevent critical resource information from reaching London, information that would have given the Crown significant advantages in controlling colonial economic development. "This transforms our understanding of pre-revolutionary politics," Dr. Montgomery said, her professional composure giving way to scholarly excitement. "These documents suggest organized resistance to Crown economic policy existed decades earlier than previously documented, with intelligence operations that would rival modern espionage networks." For Marcus, the historical revelations provided context for his uncle's decades-long obsession. Robert Reeves hadn't just been seeking gold and silver. He had been pursuing historical truth that could reshape understanding of American origins. The treasure was real and substantial, but the historical knowledge might ultimately prove more valuable. As night fell over Deadman's Cay, most of the governmental vessels departed, leaving only a security team to monitor the site overnight. Marcus found himself alone on the Eleanor for the first time since the official operation had begun. The sudden quiet both welcome and disorienting after days of intense activity. His satellite phone rang a call from a veterans support organization he had worked with during his difficult transition to civilian life. The director, Sandra Martinez, had somehow heard about his discovery. "Marcus, I've been seeing your name in news reports all day. Is it true what they're saying about the shipwreck?" "It's true," he confirmed, still struggling to believe it himself. "My uncle was right all along. The Queen Anne's Mercy was exactly where he predicted, with cargo that appears to be worth hundreds of millions." "That's incredible," Sandra said, genuine happiness in her voice. "I remember how you were struggling when you first came to our transition program. To think that just a few years later, you'd make one of the most significant historical discoveries of the decade. It's inspiring." The conversation shifted to how Marcus's changed circumstances might benefit other veterans facing the same challenges he had recently overcome. "Once the salvage rights are settled, I want to establish a foundation," Marcus told her. "Something focused on veterans with disabilities who need support transitioning to civilian careers." "You could make a tremendous difference," Sandra agreed. "The system fails too many warriors who gave everything for their country." After the call ended, Marcus stood on the deck of his uncle's boat, looking toward the island that had transformed from worthless inheritance to priceless discovery. The security lights around the wreck site created a gentle glow on the water, marking the location where centuries of history had been preserved beneath the waves. The next morning brought the beginning of the formal excavation process. With the astronomical low-tide window closing, specialized equipment was positioned to allow continued access to the wreck even as water levels returned to normal. Underwater archaeologists would now continue the work Marcus had begun during the brief exposure of the site. Attorney Whitaker arrived with preliminary paperwork from federal agencies acknowledging Marcus's priority claim as the discoverer based on his uncle's research. The documents established his consultation rights throughout the excavation process and outlined the framework for determining his salvage compensation once the full recovery was complete. Based on preliminary agreements, we've secured a significant advance against your eventual salvage rights, Whitaker explained, presenting Marcus with documentation for a bank account containing $5 million. This allows you immediate financial security while the full legal process unfolds, which could take 18 to 24 months. The figure on the bank document, more money than Marcus had ever expected to see in his lifetime, represented less than 3% of his potential total claim. The scale of the wealth headed his way remained difficult to comprehend. For someone who had recently been counting coins for laundry money, Dr. Montgomery joined them for a final site consultation before Marcus would return to the mainland to begin the next phase of the discovery process. The conservation of the artifacts we've recovered is already underway at our facility in Washington, she explained. The historical significance is even greater than initially assessed, particularly the documentation of covert British resource exploration. As Marcus prepared to depart, Deadman's Cay on the Eleanor, he took a final walk around the island that had seemed so worthless just days earlier. The hurricane had scoured away vegetation to expose rocky formations that his uncle had mapped decades earlier, formations that had guided his theory about where the Mercy would have run aground in 1752. Standing at the cairn where he had found his uncle's letter, Marcus added a stone of his own to the pile, a small gesture of continuity between Robert's quest and its unexpected fulfillment. The island would never again be the abandoned rock it had appeared when he first arrived. Now it would be preserved as a historical site, its name and significance permanently etched in maritime archaeology. As he navigated the Eleanor away from the island, Marcus glanced back at the government vessels continuing their work at the wreck site. The worthless inheritance had yielded not just material treasure beyond imagination, but historical knowledge that would reshape understanding of colonial America and the forces that led to revolution. More importantly for Marcus personally, it had transformed his life from one of struggle and uncertainty to one of purpose and possibility. The prosthetic leg that had seemed to define his limitations now served as a reminder of his resilience, the same quality that had driven his uncle to pursue a theory everyone else had dismissed as fantasy. The journey back to the mainland symbolized more than physical distance. Marcus was returning to a world that would view him differently, not as a disabled veteran struggling to make ends meet, but as the discoverer of one of history's most significant shipwrecks and the heir to a fortune that would allow him to help others facing the challenges he had recently overcome. As the coastline of North Carolina appeared on the horizon, Marcus thought about the chain of unlikely events that had led to this moment: an estranged uncle's bequest, a hurricane's perfect timing, an astronomical tide cycle occurring just when he had nothing left to lose. Individually, each seemed like random chance. Together, they formed a pattern that felt something like destiny. The inheritance that had initially seemed like his uncle's final joke had become Robert Reeves's greatest gift, not just to his nephew, but to history itself. The worthless island had yielded treasures beyond gold and silver, knowledge that would change understanding of the past and opportunities that would reshape countless futures, beginning with Marcus's own. 6 months after the discovery of the Queen Anne's Mercy, Marcus Reeves stood at the podium in the Grand Hall of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. Behind him, displayed in a state-of-the-art exhibition case, rested Captain Blackwell's journal, the document that had rewritten understanding of pre-revolutionary American history. Around the room, conserved artifacts from the Colonial shipwreck gleamed under museum lighting, each item telling part of a story that had remained hidden beneath the Atlantic for centuries. When I inherited Deadman's Cay, Marcus began, addressing the crowd of historians, government officials, and media representatives gathered for the opening of the Queen Anne's Mercy, Secrets of Colonial America exhibition. I saw it as a worthless rock that represented the final joke from an eccentric uncle. Never could I have imagined that, within days, that inheritance would yield one of history's most significant archaeological discoveries. The audience included Dr. Montgomery, who had overseen the conservation of the shipwreck's artifacts, Agent Larson, whose initial intervention had helped establish Marcus's legal rights to the discovery, and Attorney Whitaker, whose guidance had navigated the complex legal landscape of maritime salvage rights. But most meaningful to Marcus were the 24 veterans seated in the front row, former service members who had struggled with the same challenges he had faced after leaving military service. The greatest treasures from the Mercy aren't the gold and silver coins, Marcus continued, gesturing to the impressive display of colonial currency. They're the documents and artifacts that have transformed our understanding of American origins. Captain Blackwell's journals reveal organized resistance to Crown, economic control decades earlier than previously documented, with intelligence operations that rivaled modern espionage networks. The discovery had indeed revolutionized historical understanding of the colonial period. The Queen Anne's Mercy documents proved that British authorities had conducted secret resource surveys throughout territories nominally controlled by France, gathering intelligence about gold deposits and other valuable commodities that would later influence Crown policies, restricting westward expansion. More dramatically, Captain Blackwell's journals revealed his role as a double agent working for colonial interests, who had intentionally scuttled the Mercy to prevent this strategic information from reaching London. What Robert Reeves had theorized as a smuggling operation had actually been an early act of colonial resistance, a deliberate sacrifice to undermine Crown authority 23 years before the Declaration of Independence. My uncle spent 30 years pursuing this historical truth when everyone told him he was chasing ghosts, Marcus said, his voice carrying emotion that resonated through the marble hall. His perseverance in the face of ridicule reminds us that sometimes the greatest discoveries come to those willing to follow their convictions when all evidence suggests they should quit. The formal proceedings concluded with the Smithsonian's director announcing the establishment of the Robert Reeves Fellowship for Maritime Historical Research, a program that would support unconventional historical investigations that might otherwise struggle to receive academic funding. The first recipient would be a promising graduate student whose theories about unreported colonial naval engagements had been dismissed by mainstream historians. After the ceremony, as guests explored the exhibition, Marcus found himself approached by James Fletcher, the Director of Veteran Services for North Carolina. The Veterans Rise Foundation is making waves throughout the military community, Fletcher said, referring to the organization Marcus had established with a portion of his salvage rights. Your transitional housing program is already changing lives. The foundation, now 6 months old, had already helped over 200 veterans navigate the challenging transition from military to civilian life. With a focus on wounded warriors and those with combat-related disabilities, the program provided housing, vocational training, medical advocacy, and a critical element Marcus had found most lacking in his own experience, a sense of continued purpose. "We're just getting started," Marcus replied, watching one of the program's graduates, a former Army sergeant who had lost both legs in Syria, confidently navigating the museum in his new prosthetics. The next phase includes specialized facilities for veterans with prosthetic limbs and a partnership with medical engineering programs to develop improved assistive technologies. The foundation represented Marcus's response to his changed circumstances, a recognition that the treasure he had discovered carried responsibilities along with opportunities. The salvage rights settlement had ultimately yielded $178 million for his personal share of the recovered gold and silver, along with ongoing consultation fees for the historical documentation and exhibition rights. The wealth had transformed his material circumstances from poverty to abundance in the blink of an eye. The modest apartment with its leaking ceiling had been replaced by a thoughtfully designed home outside Wilmington, accessible for his own needs and available to host other disabled veterans during their rehabilitation. The Eleanor had been fully restored, now serving as both his personal vessel and occasionally as a therapeutic sailing platform for veterans working through PTSD and physical injuries. But more meaningful than the material transformation was the sense of purpose that had emerged from the discovery. Marcus had found not just treasure but direction, a way to use his unexpected good fortune to address the systemic failures he had experienced firsthand during his own difficult transition from wounded warrior to civilian. As the exhibition opening transitioned to an evening reception, Marcus excused himself briefly to meet with Dr. Montgomery in the conservation laboratory adjacent to the exhibition hall. There, technicians continued the painstaking process of preserving the thousands of artifacts recovered from the Mercy. "We've made a breakthrough with the encrypted messages found in Blackwell's quarters," Dr. Montgomery explained, showing Marcus a series of documents displayed on specialized conservation tables. These reveal communication with a network of colonial sympathizers throughout North American settlements, coordinating information gathering about British military and economic operations. "So Blackwell wasn't just a rogue captain," Marcus observed, studying the decoded messages. "He was part of an organized resistance movement that predated the committees of correspondence by decades." "Exactly. And these documents suggest connections to figures we've traditionally associated with the later Revolutionary period ancestors of men who would eventually become founding fathers. The implications are staggering for understanding the deep roots of American independence." The historical revelations continued to unfold month by month as researchers analyzed the wealth of documentation recovered from the Mercy. The traditional timeline of colonial resistance to British authority was being fundamentally rewritten, with evidence suggesting organized opposition to Crown economic policies had existed in sophisticated networks far earlier than previously understood. Captain Blackwell, once presumed a loyal British officer who had perished in an unfortunate navigational accident, was emerging as perhaps one of America's earliest revolutionary heroes, a man who had sacrificed his ship, career, and ultimately his life to prevent the Crown from gaining economic intelligence that would have strengthened its hold on the colonies. As Marcus returned to the reception, he found himself approached by a young woman whose military bearing was evident despite her civilian clothes. "Staff Sergeant Lisa Hernandez, sir," she introduced herself with the crisp precision that never fully leaves those who have served. "I'm one of the first participants in your Veterans Rise program. How's it working for you?" Marcus asked, immediately shifting his focus from historical revelations to the present-day impact of his foundation's work. "It saved my life," Hernandez said simply. "After 3 tours in Afghanistan and losing my right arm, I was on the verge of becoming another veteran suicide statistic. Your housing program and the prosthetics development partnership gave me back a sense of purpose I thought I'd lost forever." Hernandez now worked as an advocate for other wounded warriors navigating the labyrinthine VA system, using her first-hand experience to help others avoid the bureaucratic pitfalls that had nearly broken her spirit. "The most important thing your program provides isn't the housing or even the medical support," she told Marcus. "It's the reminder that our story isn't over just because our military service ended." Her words resonated deeply with Marcus, reflecting his own journey from desperation to renewed purpose. 6 months earlier, he had been facing eviction and drowning in medical bills, his military service seeming increasingly irrelevant in a civilian world that struggled to understand the challenges of wounded warriors. Now he had not only financial security, but meaningful work addressing the very systems that had failed him. Later that evening, as the museum event concluded, Marcus found himself in conversation with Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a historian whose academic career had been built studying colonial resistance to British authority. The Blackwell documents have fundamentally altered my understanding of pre-revolutionary organization, she admitted with the humility of a true scholar. I've spent 20 years researching this period, and these materials reveal an entirely different dimension to colonial response to British economic control. My uncle would have enjoyed hearing that from a Harvard historian, Marcus replied with a smile. He was dismissed by academia his entire life. A lesson in intellectual humility for all of us, Dr. Chun acknowledged. The most significant historical discovery of the decade came not from a university research team, but from a man everyone dismissed as an eccentric treasure hunter. The following morning, Marcus attended a special ceremony at Arlington National Cemetery, where a memorial was being dedicated to the veterans who had never fully made it home, not those who had died in combat, but those who had succumbed to suicide, addiction, homelessness, and inadequate support after their military service ended. The ceremony held particular significance for Marcus, who had lost 2 friends from his unit to suicide in the years following their deployment. Their deaths had occurred not amid the drama of combat, but in the quiet desperation that sometimes followed, when purpose and community had been stripped away along with uniform and rank. The true cost of war extends far beyond the battlefield, the VA secretary acknowledged in her remarks. Programs like the Veterans Rise Foundation remind us that supporting our warriors requires sustained commitment throughout their entire lives, not just during their years of active service. Marcus had been asked to speak at the ceremony, a recognition of how his foundation had rapidly become a model for innovative veteran support. Standing before the gathered families, officials, and media, he reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, I was a disabled combat veteran struggling with the transition to civilian life, facing eviction, drowning in medical bills, and losing hope that anything would ever change, he began, his honesty drawing nods of recognition from many veterans in the audience. An unexpected inheritance that initially seemed worthless became the catalyst for transformation, not just for me personally, but for our understanding of how we can better serve those who have served our nation. Marcus described how his own experiences navigating inadequate support systems had informed the development of the Veterans Rise model, which emphasized peer support, practical assistance with immediate needs like housing and medical care, and most importantly, restoration of purpose and community. What wounded warriors need most isn't charity, it's opportunity, he continued. Opportunity to continue serving, to apply their skills and experience in meaningful ways, to belong to something larger than themselves. That sense of purpose and belonging is what many of us miss most after leaving military service. The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a simple but powerful memorial, a circle of empty combat boots surrounding a single phrase. The battle continues at home. The installation recognized the ongoing struggles many veterans faced after returning from deployment, struggles that often remained invisible to the civilian population they had served. In the afternoon, Marcus visited the Veterans Rise campus outside Wilmington, a 40-acre property that had been transformed from an abandoned corporate retreat into a comprehensive support center for transitioning service members. The facility included accessible housing units, vocational training facilities, medical coordination services, and recreational areas designed to rebuild both physical capabilities and social connections. Lisa Hernandez, now serving as the program's peer support coordinator, led Marcus through the campus, introducing him to current participants and showcasing recent innovations in the program model. "We're seeing incredible results with the combined approach," she explained, as they toured the prosthetics development lab where engineers worked alongside veterans to design improved assistive devices. "The suicide prevention outcomes are particularly striking," she continued, showing Marcus data from the program's first 6 months. Participants show an 87% reduction in suicidal ideation after 3 months in the program, compared to similar populations receiving standard VA care. The statistics were encouraging, but the real impact was visible in the faces of program participants, men and women who had arrived broken by war and the challenges of reintegration, now finding renewed purpose and community. A Marine who had lost both legs was teaching adaptive fitness classes. An Army communications specialist with PTSD was training service dogs for other veterans. A Navy corpsman with a traumatic brain injury was coordinating medical advocacy for newer participants. "This is the real treasure from the Queen Anne's Mercy," Marcus observed as they watched a group of veterans working together to build an accessible cabin for a recently arrived participant. Not the gold or the historical artifacts, but the opportunity to create something that makes a difference in people's lives. That evening, Marcus returned to the harbor where the Eleanor was docked, the vessel that had carried him to Deadman's Cay, and the discovery that had transformed his life. The boat had been fully restored, its weathered appearance replaced by fresh paint and updated equipment. But Marcus had insisted on preserving its essential character and his uncle's navigational charts as a reminder of the journey that had brought him here. Standing on the deck as the sun set over the Atlantic, Marcus reflected on the extraordinary chain of events that had unfolded over the past 6 months. The inheritance that had initially seemed worthless had yielded not just material treasure, but historical knowledge that was reshaping understanding of American origins. The hurricane that should have driven him away from Deadman's Cay had instead exposed what generations of scholars had dismissed as fantasy. More personally, the discovery had transformed Marcus from a struggling veteran on the verge of homelessness to someone with both the resources and the platform to address the systemic failures he had experienced firsthand. The foundation he had established was already changing lives, creating the support system he had needed during his own darkest days. The phone call that interrupted his reflection came from Dr. Montgomery at the Smithsonian. "Marcus, we've just completed the translation of the final encrypted documents from Blackwell's cabin," she said, excitement evident in her voice. "They confirm something extraordinary. Your ancestor, William Reeves, wasn't just a colonial customs official, as family records suggested. He was Blackwell's primary contact in the resistance network." The revelation added a personal dimension to the historical discovery. Marcus's own ancestors had been part of the early resistance movement that Blackwell had served, perhaps explaining why the family oral history had preserved fragments of the story that had guided Robert Reeves in his search for the Mercy. So, my uncle wasn't just following historical records, Marcus realized. He was following his own family's connection to this ship. Exactly. The Reeves family was connected to the Mercy, not just through historical research but through direct ancestral involvement in its final mission. Your uncle somehow sensed this connection even without having all the documentary evidence. The discovery completed a circle that spanned centuries, from William Reeves's role in the colonial resistance movement, to Robert Reeves's lifelong quest to find the ship, to Marcus's unexpected role in bringing the truth to light. What had seemed like an eccentric obsession passed from uncle to nephew now appeared as a family legacy finding its fulfillment across generations. 1 year to the day after Marcus had first set foot on Deadman's Cay, he stood again on its rocky shore, no longer the desperate veteran seeking any opportunity, but the founder of a movement transforming veteran care across the nation. The island had been designated a National Historic Site, with a small museum near the spot where the hurricane had first exposed the Mercy to modern eyes. The cairn where Marcus had found his uncle's letter remained, now protected by a simple structure that preserved it without diminishing its weathered authenticity. Beside it stood a bronze plaque commemorating Robert Reeves's 30-year quest in the discovery that had vindicated his theories when everyone else had dismissed them as fantasy. A group of veterans from the Rise Foundation accompanied Marcus on this pilgrimage, men and women who had found renewed purpose through the programs his discovery had made possible. Among them was Lisa Hernandez, whose leadership had been instrumental in the Foundation's rapid growth and success. Sometimes the thing that seems most worthless contains the greatest treasure, Marcus told them as they gathered around the cairn. This barren island looked like nothing but rocks and scrub brush when I inherited it. My uncle's obsession seemed like madness until it was proven to be vision. The veterans nodded in understanding, many having experienced their own journey from despair to renewed purpose through the Foundation's programs. Their military experience, sometimes including severe injuries that civilian society struggled to accommodate, had often seemed like a liability rather than an asset in their post-service lives. Through the Rise Foundation, they had rediscovered the value of their training, resilience, and perspective. The most powerful transformation isn't finding gold beneath the waves, Marcus continued, looking out at the ocean where the Mercy had rested for centuries. It's finding purpose where you thought there was only emptiness. It's discovering that what seemed like the end of your story was actually just the beginning of a new chapter. As the group returned to the Eleanor for the journey back to the mainland, Marcus paused for a final moment alone on the island's shore. He placed a weathered coin, one of the few he had kept from the wreck, as a personal memento beside the cairn his uncle had built. "You were right all along," he said quietly, as if Robert could somehow hear him across the divide of years. "Not just about the shipwreck, but about persistence in the face of doubt. About believing in your vision when everyone else called you crazy. About understanding that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't the ones that glitter." From worthless inheritance to historic discovery, from desperate veteran to Foundation leader, from isolation to community, Marcus Reeves had navigated a transformation as dramatic as any hurricane. The treasure beneath the waves had provided the resources, but the true value lay in what those resources made possible: renewed purpose, restored dignity, and the opportunity to ensure that other wounded warriors wouldn't face the same struggles alone. As the Eleanor sailed away from Deadman's Cay with its cargo of veterans, whose lives had been transformed through the Foundation, Marcus reflected that perhaps this was the greatest treasure of all, not what had been found beneath the waves, but what had been built upon that discovery. Gold and silver could purchase comfort, but purpose and community sustained the human spirit in ways no material wealth ever could. The inheritance that had seemed worthless had yielded treasures beyond imagination, not just in artifacts and gold, but in the opportunity to create meaningful change in the lives of those who had sacrificed for their country, only to find themselves struggling alone upon their return. Sometimes, it seemed, the path forward revealed itself only when all logical options had been exhausted and only faith remained. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.